Good evening, everyone. I am, oops. So good evening, everyone. My name is Pastor Kirby Spivey. So grateful to have all of you on our Zoom call on this evening, this special Zoom. We do Bible study every week, and since the week before Easter, or the week before Holy Week, I started a teaching series on Revelation. We were just getting started in COVID times. This is what I call it, COVID times. And a lot of people were curious and interested, is this the end times? And so the book of the Bible that speaks most relevant to Revelation speaks most relevant to end times is Revelation. And so, I've not done a study on Revelation since being here in Nova Scotia. And so we got some special requests for it. And so if you are interested in catching up with us, if you have not been following along with us, and so we are, I believe, at chapter 8 now, but all of the studies are on YouTube. And so you can just type my name in, Kirby Spivey, and go to my YouTube page, and they are archived for you there. But tonight we have a very special guest. I'm actually just waiting for him to arrive. Dr. Brian K. Blount. I met Dr. Blount when I was a young warthog, over 20 years ago now at Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Blount was New Testament professor back in those days, and his primary book was on the Gospel of Mark called Go Preach. And then while I was there, he finished a book and called Can I Get a Witness? There's another one too, Then the Whisper Put on Flesh. He was busy during that time. He is a preeminent New Testament scholar, respected world around for his work in the New Testament and for his work in the blended space of cultural studies and New Testament studies. And so he is our guest tonight. I'm so peacock proud, just waiting for his arrival. So thank you so much for your patience. And we're going to be getting started very shortly, as soon as he comes on. So thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you are not familiar with the Zoom, I have now done the process of linking to YouTube, so you can catch this same stream on YouTube. And if you are more familiar with Facebook, the link is now there on Facebook as well. I've asked already, if you would please keep yourself muted, because there are, how many people on the call? We have 18 current participants, and I'm expecting more as the night goes on. And so if you've never done a Zoom call, everybody basically can be heard. So if you could keep and then also it makes feedback, and it can get pretty, not nice. So if you could keep yourself muted, if you're going to stay on the Zoom call. Also, as I said, the Facebook is available now, and the YouTube is up and live. So we're just going to, again, we're waiting on our guest for tonight, and we'll be right back.
Pastor? Left.
Pastor Brenton,
Yes.
my sister Luella's trying to get in on YouTube.
Okay. She needs to go.
Pastor Brenton,
Mm-hmm. She needs to go to Kirby Spivey.
my sister Luella's trying to get in on YouTube.
Mm-hmm. She needs to go.
Pastor Brenton.
Mm-hmm.
Why does it keep repeating?
Go to Kirby Spivey. Oh, because I had both things going. Okay, go ahead, Sister Lynn. Sorry.
So what does she do?
She needs to go to Kirby Spivey's channel. So just in the search box, tell her to search Kirby Spivey, and it'll take her to his channel. And she should see the screen there. I just had it up. That's why you kept hearing it again. I was watching both things, Zoom and YouTube.
Okay, so she goes to Kirby Spivey channel.
Right. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Pastor Porter.
Okay, Luella's in.
Excellent.
Yeah. So,
Pastor Spivey.
where did he go?
He went to check on Dr. Blount. Pastor Spivey.
Yes, ma'am.
You may want to mute all participants because we have a couple of people on the phone and they can't mute themselves.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
You may want to mute all participants because we have a couple of people on the phone and they can't mute themselves.
Okay. I don't know what to put in. What the
Okay, microphone is muted.
No, you're not muted, Deacon. You need to mute yourself.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. We are just waiting for a few more moments for our guest on tonight. For those that just tuned in, you are in the right place at the right time. I thank you and appreciate you for your continued patience.
Take me to the king. Don't have much to bring. My heart's torn in pieces. It's my offering. Take me to the king. Truth is I'm tired. Options are few. I'm trying to pray, but where are you? I'm all churched out, hurt and abused. Where are you? Faith, I'm all turned to do. Truth is I'm weak, no strength to fight, no tears to cry. Even if I try, but still my soul refuses to die. Mhm. One touch will change my life. Take me to the King. I don't have much to bring. My heart's torn in pieces. It's my offering. Lay me at the throne. Leave me there alone to gaze upon your glory and sing to you this song. Please take me to the King. Truth is, it's time to stop playing these games. We need a word for the people's pain. So Lord, speak right now. Let it pour like rain. Oh yeah, we're desperate. We're chasing after you. Oh, no rules, no religion. I made my decision to run to you. don't have much to bring. My heart's torn to pieces. It's my
I see Dr. Blunt is on, so I turn the music off.
Rhonda, how are you? It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It's been quite some time.
Yes, sir.
Now tell me where you are. The last time I remember you were in Nova Scotia.
I'm still in Nova Scotia.
Okay. Kirby, how are you doing?
Yes, sir.
And tell me where you are. The last time I remember you were in Nova Scotia.
All right. Good evening, Dr. Blount. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. How are you doing, Kirby?
Excellent. Let me just mute all except and then I'll bring you back on, Dr. Blount.
Good evening, Dr. Blunt. How are you? I'm doing just fine. How are you doing?
Excellent. Let me just mute all except and then I'll bring you back on. All right. So can you hear me?
I can. I hear a little bit of feedback, but I can hear you pretty clearly.
Yeah, I'm getting it as well. Let me see. Is that better?
Yes, that is.
Awesome. So, good evening. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine. I hope you're well.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Good to see you.
Well, it's good to see you too.
How are things in Virginia?
Well, they're going very nicely. The school is doing okay. We're, doing our online thing. So I'm on Zoom quite a bit these days.
Good. Your family as well?
Doing very well. Thank you. Yeah, we're all doing nicely. I hope
Awesome.
yours is also too.
So let me, I introduced you one time, but now that your face is actually in the screen, let me do it again. And I hope that your cheeks don't turn too rosy. But everyone, I'd love to introduce you and introduce and present to some my beloved New Testament professor. His name is Dr. Brian Blount. Brian K. Blount. I met him as a young whippersnapper, young warthog, as a student at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I made it my business to take every single class that Dr. Blount ever taught, and that was not just for me. That was most of us students at Princeton Seminary. Definitely Professor beloved, not just because he's a great person, great human being, but his classes were fun and engaging and always learned something from them. And on the occasion that he would preach in class or preach in the chapel, it was always an amazing experience. One of my favorite sermons of Dr. Blount's is When Pigs Fly. It sounds crazy, but it was a crazy sermon. So When Pigs Fly is definitely one of those things. So Dr. Blount, I'm going to let you take center stage, and then afterward, after your mini presentation to us, we'll come back on for some discussion back and forth. Just to let you know, so we are on Zoom. You and I are Zooming, and we also have some other people of God on Zoom as well. We're also on Facebook, and we're also on YouTube. So our reach is, we're trying to cast a wide net. I have been teaching Revelation out of your book from the week before Holy Week, and we are sitting at right about chapter 8 right now. So we just opened the seals.
Oh, okay, okay.
We just opened the seals. I don't think we got to the seventh seal yet, which is chapter 8, but we opened the first 6 and saw, who are these in white robes? So that gives you just an understanding of where we are as walking through Revelation. So thank you so much for joining us, and everyone out there, thank you so much for your patience. And I'm excited to hear what Dr. Blount has to say.
Well, thank you, Kirby. It is a joy to be with all of you and to have this opportunity to be in a classroom with Kirby once again. As you may know from my book, Can I Get a Witness? Reading Revelation Through an African-American Lens, I was very inspired by a presentation that he did in the class, so inspired that I actually asked him if I could use it as a part of that publication. And so I opened the chapter on the hymns of the book of Revelation as resistance literature with a rap piece that he constructed for that course. It was a wonderful way of bringing a contemporary flavor into the first century hymns that John is recording and using as resistance music in the book of Revelation. And it explores the way in which we are able to see that the book of Revelation is not only meaningful for people in the first century, but it has a powerful meaning of resistance and witness for those of us who live in the 21st century. Unfortunately, too many interpreters of the book of Revelation bring it into a contemporary frame, not as a piece of resistance literature wanting people to witness to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, but as a piece of literature that is attempting to predict the times. Now, Revelation was, John's revelation to his churches was intended not to predict the future, but to transform the present. He wanted his community to live in the present in a way that could change, could transform the landscape of the church, could transform the landscape of the entire world. And he talked about the fact that God's reign, God's kingdom was about to break in at any moment, with the hope that this would give some urgency to people in the present time to go about the business of making the changes that were necessary. In that book, Can I Get a Witness? One of the things I found interesting as a parallel to the contemporary time frame is that of the civil rights movement. I saw in John's literature the understanding that John was asking his people to respond to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, to proclaim the Lordship of Jesus Christ in a context where people could lose their lives, their social standing, their property, almost anything they had, their relationship to family, but certainly the most drastic consequence would be the loss of their lives. He wanted them to do that, to make that proclamation, despite the fact that that the consequences could be severe. He is asking them to do it based on the understanding that Jesus himself did the very same thing. When I talk about the book of Revelation, I begin with the understanding that there are many visions in the book, but there is one revelation. That revelation is that Jesus Christ is Lord. Jesus made the claim, he witnessed to that revelation in his own life. One of the primary places where that happens is in the trial scene at the end of his life, when he is hauled before the tribunal, that is the Sanhedrin, the Jewish High Council, the Temple High Council in the temple in Jerusalem. And he is asked the question, are you the Son of the Blessed? Are you the one who represents God's identity and purpose in human history? And he makes the claim, knowing the consequence, knowing that it would cost him his life, he makes the claim that yes, he is. He witnesses to his own lordship despite the consequences. He becomes, quote unquote, the first martyr in that regard. And when I say martyr, I don't mean martyr in the sense that it's been interpreted after the 2nd century and on into our time. That means someone who dies for his or her faith. John is not asking his believers to die for their faith. He's asking them to do what Jesus did, to witness for their faith, to witness for the Lordship of Jesus Christ, despite the fact that it might mean they might lose their lives. But there are other consequences. They could lose their freedom, as John himself did as he was exiled on the Patmos. They could lose their social standing. They could lose their reputation. These kinds of consequences were also a part of that endeavor. Jesus is proclaiming his own relationship, his identification with God, that he's the one who represents God's intent and purpose in human history, despite the consequences he knows may result. In that case, he is the prime, foremost, first witness in John's understanding. John asks his people to do the very same thing. And that's why he calls his book The Revelation of Jesus Christ. It is not the revelation about Jesus Christ as much as it is Jesus's own revelation. He wants his people to witness to the same thing Jesus witnessed to, that Jesus was Lord, the one who represents God on earth. Knowing the consequences, he still demands that his people stand up and make that claim. It's unique for us in our contemporary world because we don't have or don't fear the same consequences that John's people feared in the first century. There may be some small consequence to making the claim that Jesus Christ is Lord, but we're certainly not threatened with our lives, although there are some Christians in some parts of the world who still are. But here in the United States, primarily, that's not the case. It's not the case that we necessarily lose social standing or we're going to be exiled for making that claim. So we don't have the same sense of concern about that witnessing that John's people did. In his 7 churches, John is concerned that his people, because of the fear of making that claim, that they won't make it, that they will care more about their own lives than they will care about making the proclamation of Jesus's lordship, and therefore to save their lives, they will go quiet. His concern is that his churches are quiet. He knows that any church in the first century that makes the claim about Jesus's lordship, when Rome was making the claim that Rome and Caesar were Lord, will suffer. There will be a lot of consternation around that church. So when he looks at his churches and he sees quiet circumstances, he begins to wonder about the faithfulness of those churches. And that's really why he's angry. We want quiet churches today in many cases. I think we don't want a lot of turmoil around our churches. John looks at these churches and finds if there's no turmoil, there's really no faithfulness, because a church that is being faithful is going to be caught up in turmoil. One might suggest that in a way in which we need prophetic voices today, that may well be the same circumstance. That if you're going to speak out prophetically as a church, if you're going to live into the proclamation that God is transforming and bringing about social justice and what that requires for God's people, that may well put the church in a situation and circumstance of consternation today. So the question would be, if John were to look at our churches the way he looked at his 7 churches, would he wonder why or whether our churches were too quiet? That's certainly his concern for his churches. As I move forward, one of the things I tried to get across in both the commentary and in that book, Can I Get a Witness, was not only that John was asking his people to witness in this way, not only was he asking them to do it knowing that there might be severe consequences, but he was asking them to do it in a form of resistance to the claim that some other power, some other person was Lord. He's asking them to make that resistance in a nonviolent way, even though a huge amount of violence was going on around them. So there's some key terms in the book that I translate differently, and you probably have already noted one of those in looking at some of the earlier chapters in my commentary. The key one is this Greek word hupomone, which is translated most often patient endurance. John isn't really asking for patient endurance. He's asking for nonviolent resistance. He's asking his people to resist the claim that a human government or the leader of a human government is Lord, should require things like ultimate devotion, should require worship, should require the kind of patriotism to it, to the country or to the person that should be given, the loyalty that should be given only to God. John is deeply concerned about that circumstance because he believes that circumstance has developed in Rome, in the areas where his churches are located, and he's calling for his people to resist such claims, knowing the consequences. He's not asking them to fight in a violent way, even though there is a lot of violence that's going on in the book between God and Satan. He's asking his people, however, to resist, knowing that they will suffer as a result of that witness. And therefore, he wants them to be like the lamb in chapter 5, the lamb who conquers by being slaughtered. So when you get to chapter 7, then you get to chapter 8, and he sees this great multitude up in the heavens that cannot be counted. These are the ones who have come through the great ordeal. They have been slaughtered as the lamb has been slaughtered, because they have testified as the lamb testified that Jesus Christ and not a human power or a human person is Lord. So that in a nutshell is the focus of the book. You get these emphases in the book that give urgency to such a claim. And these emphases would be, for example, in the hymns. And that brings me back to the rap song that Kirby used in the last chapter of that book, Can I Get a Witness? You get these 9 hymns in the book of Revelation. There, 7 of them are antiphonal, meaning there's call and response. John calls out, and then the crowd that hears him, they call back amen, or they call back hallelujah. They respond to what John is crying out. The first hymn, the first great hymn, is in chapter 4, where John talks about the greatness of God, because God is creator and therefore is due all allegiance and worship. And then the Lamb is the subject of the second hymn in chapter 5. But then there are these other hymns that continue on through the book of Revelation. They have the same theme. It is a musical call to stand up and resist through singing. So again, I think very much of the civil rights movement in the United States, where music, where song, where singing was one of the ways in which African Americans, both leaders and those who were following them, built up their sense of courage and community in the face of the hostility that was in front of them. And music became a strong part of that. What I try to do in that last chapter in that small book is to trace not just the music that we heard during the civil rights movement, but the music that goes all the way back to the slave songs, the spirituals, to gospel music, to jazz, and to rap music, all the way into the kind of hip hop music that is also about resistance. That music is trying to do the same thing for Black people that the music, the hymns of Revelation was trying to do for these Christ people in the first century in John's churches. The second thing that should not be missed about the way in which all of this develops is that there is this enemy for John, and the enemy is identified as the great red dragon in chapter 12. It is the presence of evil that is personal, that is powerful, and that sense of evil possesses countries and people. In this case, it has possessed Rome, and it has possessed the cities like Thyatira and Laodicea and Philadelphia and Pergamum, the cities where John's 7 churches are located, and caused those cities to proclaim that they, not God, held ultimate power over human life, and therefore they should be worshiped as Rome should be worshiped, and therefore they put themselves in a place where only God should ever be located, and that is a draconian evil. And anybody who gives allegiance to those countries or those people or to that kind of belief are prostituting themselves to a foreign understanding, a foreign faith, not to the true faithfulness to God. So John is concerned about all of that. So what John wants is that you not give in to these inducements of Rome or these other governments, economic and political benefits that they could give, or the threats they could give, threats to your livelihood, to your social standing, or even threats to take away your life. So John wants his people to resist all of that, knowing that it is a pervasive draconian evil that has possessed the world in the same way that demons possess people in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Jesus confronts them. So John is really asking his people to confront this demonic in the same way that Jesus confronted demonic powers in the Gospels in his own ministry. And then one of the last things I would point out before going to a time where we can have some, I'd very much like to hear your questions and have a dialogue with you, is that there is this expectation that despite how difficult it looks, And it does look difficult in the book of Revelation. Things are bad. One of the key questions the book of Revelation is asking is, where is God in the midst of all this turmoil and chaos and trouble? Draconian evil living itself out through Rome, and the beast from the land, which would be represented by the governments of Thyatira and Pergamum and Laodicea, all these governments where the churches are located. It looks like Rome's claim is the true claim, because Rome not only crucified Christ, but Rome appears to be the great world power that everybody must pay obedience to, must fall down and give worship to. So how is it that that God is in control when it looks like the world is not only out of control, but that the world is being controlled by these hostile forces and hostile powers? John, one of the reasons he's writing his book is to explain that it only appears to look as though Rome has control. Rome's control will be for a temporary short period of time, and God will ultimately usher in God's rule. Be faithful to God, because when God breaks in, you want to be on the side with God as that confrontation unfolds. And those who are faithful to God will be lifted up, redeemed, and recognized at the point of God's or Jesus's return, and Jesus's ultimate claim to authority at the time when the new heaven and the new earth and the end of the book, when that time occurs. So what is John looking for? He is looking for people who are faithful enough to believe that in a circumstance where it looks like the world is out of control, God is indeed in control. And therefore, you don't have in the book of Revelation a rapture. There is nobody raptured out of the ordeals, the persecutions that are taking place. The reason why there is no rapture out of the ordeal is because John believes the person who shows the greatest amount of faith is the person who is able to witness in and through the ordeal. That's the person who demonstrates faith. If you can proclaim and live out that proclamation that Jesus Christ is Lord in a circumstance where it looks like Rome is Lord, then you are the kind of witness Jesus himself was, or Antipas was, one of the members of the 7 churches that John lifts up, or John himself was exiled onto the island of Patmos because he defiantly proclaimed the lordship of Jesus Christ. So no rapture, but faithfulness. The great moment, the kind of life that I think John wants to see his people live is a kind of faithful witnessing in the midst of the storm that God is the presence and the coming of calm. So that's a bit of my sense of the book of Revelation. Let me throw that out as a way to begin, and I'd look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts that you might have as you've been reading this book and working through this book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blount, for that concentrated summary about your hermeneutic and thoughts into the book of Revelation. So, as you said during your presentation, a lot of interpretation surrounding Revelation has gone to the futuristic foretelling, particularly in this season that we are in, COVID-19 season, global pandemic. We got locusts in Africa currently. We have, what else do we have? The financial markets are doing what it's doing. We got number 45. So how do we reconcile your interpretation of Revelation with our traditional understanding of we're living in the last and evil days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a question that others have asked me as well as I've been talking about the book of Revelation. One of the things I point out is that the things that are happening to us, they are unique to us, but they're not unique to the world. If we look through history, before the book of Revelation was written, after the book of Revelation was written, there have been cataclysms and there have been periods of cataclysm. There have been plagues. There have been, I mean, we think about the Black Plague. I mean, even in our own context, we think about the Spanish flu in 1918, great plague upon the earth. We go back further, we think about great wars that have decimated populations. We think about the connection of well, the Black Plague in Europe. I mean, the kind of pandemics that have happened before our time. We are not the only generation historically to endure the kinds of circumstances, or to see out of these circumstances a belief, some see out of a belief, that the end time is upon us. Always in the past, it has been inaccurate. That's not to say it won't always be inaccurate. There will come a time, I think, when the end will be breaking in. I think we also need to remember Jesus's own caution in the Gospel of Mark. There will be people who will proclaim that this is the end. These are the signs in chapter 13, and they are but birth pangs of the breaking in of the kingdom. So that's the first thing. Don't be too quick to think that we are so unique in our historical period that it must be the end because these are novel kinds of circumstances. We've seen, I mean, the earth, history has seen worse than what is happening to us. The second thing is, when those circumstances happen as they do in a concentrated way in the book of Revelation, when those moments do occur, and we are in that point where John sees the end coming, I think A, we will know it, and I think B, we will sense it, if we are sensing the way John is, not as a time to run away or to seek escape, but as an opportunity to run through, to give witness to use that as an opportunity in a moment for transformation, to use it as an opportunity to declare that God is larger than the circumstances that seem to overwhelm us. Can we make such a witness about God's power and God's rule and God's lordship even in such a circumstance? So I think, you know, whether or not we can live with that or not, I think what John is doing, or at least if John of Patmos was here, I think what he would say is, if you read my book and look at the circumstances that are happening to you, it appears to me that you are being given an opportunity in the midst of this circumstance to both witness to the Lordship of Jesus Christ, and in doing that witness, to change the world in which you find yourself. You have a moment that brings about urgency. Don't use that urgency to try to escape. Use that urgency to give you more encouragement to fight for the representation of what God's rule looks for in the midst of this circumstance. So I see this as an opportunity to look at what is happening as a challenge and charge of urgency to us, rather than as a time to think about, well, is the escape valve now being opened? Are we going to be able now to rapture our way out? Is God coming to save us? I think God is presenting us with a unique opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And just for those who are live with us, particularly on Zoom, and I'm going to ask Sean if you can take a look on Facebook if people have questions. If you're on Zoom, I can see your stuff in the chat box, and so I can communicate that to Dr. Blount without too much craziness in terms of all of the microphones being there. Going to your leaning, right? And so resistance demonstrates faithfulness, right? This is the key theme that you spoke about tonight. As it relates to your, can I get a witness, and your other work. What do I want to ask? How can we in 2020 demonstrate the faithfulness that you think John was asking the 7 churches to demonstrate in the first century? One of the things that I've tried to do is, help people to understand you have to have the first century context here and understand what was going on there, and then create that bridge with where we are in the 21st century to see if there are some parallels. And so I'm asking you, what are some ways that we as contemporary believers of Jesus Christ can demonstrate the type of faithful witness that John was talking about to his first century church?
Okay. Well, let me start with the theoretical and then end with the practical. The theoretical starts with my understanding. Let me go back to Jesus and the Gospels, and then because John is working from Jesus in the Gospels, but now as the raised Christ as the Lamb. But again, remember, Jesus is the one who does his own witness. That's the revelation. Jesus' own witness to his lordship. I believe what is happening in the presentation of Jesus in the Gospels that John picks up on is that in Jesus, God's future intent for humankind is laid bare in the present. So we now then, from that theoretical, theological understanding, have a practical mandate. If we know what the future looks like that God intends for humankind, those of us who are faithful to God, it's beholden upon us to create that future in the present. Now, how do we do that? Well, we get the practical example of Jesus himself. What does God's future intent look like? Well, it looks like touching lepers. It looks like calling and women as disciples. It looks like eating with tax collectors and sex workers. It looks like putting the needs of human beings above the law, when the law would limit the opportunities for humans to be fed or to be healed. So you have these practical things in Jesus's ministry that represent God's future intent for humankind. How do you know what God's future intent is for human beings? Well, look at the practical things Jesus was doing and emulate those things. Now go to the book of Revelation with that same understanding in mind. God gives us an understanding of what the future looks like at the end of the book of Revelation with this new heaven and this new earth, where you have people of all nations and tongues and languages streaming into the New Jerusalem. So you have a wonderful sense of lack of racism and the kinds of things where one person or people or tongue are considered to be better than, and others are considered to be less than others. So that's just one thing. You have a place where the environment is in sync with human living and human intent. You have a place where I don't think you have women and men with men lording over women with power, but an equality, not just of ethnicity, but of gender. You have a heel relationship between human beings and the earth. You have these images of lordship, proclamation and worship to God and not to countries or to people. So if that is what the future looks like, then how do we practically live our lives in the present so that we bring about that future in the present? That becomes, for me, the way in which we look at the theology of the book of Revelation, living itself out in the ways in which we act and live practically. So that would mean for me, when we think about the way in which we orient ourselves toward our own government, for example, our ultimate allegiance and loyalty is not to our government, no matter what it claims, but to God, and God becomes the source of how we judge the rightness of our leaders and our government, not the other way around. We don't give ultimate allegiance to people and things, even if they're governments. We give allegiance to God, and then we look for how our allegiance to God calls us to proclaim, protest, challenge, and transform the way in which our governments operate in our lives. That's one practical example. If we look at the ways in which John's understanding of the New Jerusalem and people of every language and culture and nation and tongue, that there is an equality among them as they go into that. So there's no nationalism and racism and some ethnicities having the ability to lord it over other ethnicities. What does that mean for how we then live ourselves out as a people in a country where we know that there's a disproportionate amount of power to some races and ethnicities over against others? How do we respond to that? We can't allow, if the future looks different, we can't allow that present to be to be different from that future, and we try to figure out ways in which we can make our present look more like the future. Those are the ways in which I understand what the book of Revelation is doing. It is doing what the Gospels did. It's telling us God's future looks like this, and if God's future looks like this, how do we create that future in the present? If it is a future where God is Lord and we only worship God as Lord, what does that mean for how we live in countries and in governments with people today? That's how I would start. I would work from that framework. Our goal is to make the future, God's future, the human present. And Revelation is telling us what that future looks like. That gives us a mandate for how we act in the present. And it also helps us judge when we're not acting. And so that's why John is angry with 5 of those 7 churches. They're not acting in a way that would help create the future that John knows is coming. He wants them to participate in that future. Matter of fact, one of the verses that I think is key to the book of Revelation is chapter 12, verse 11. They conquered him. The people of God conquered the dragon and draconian evil in the world by the blood of the Lamb, which is what God does, and by the word of their testimony, which is what we do, how we live out our allegiance to God's future intent by our present behavior.
Awesome. So let's see. So I have 2 questions that have been written in, and now 3. Thank you. I want to follow up, and this isn't a whole question because I want to get to other people's questions, particularly in, I'll say, North America, more United States than Canada, but I've seen it here in Canada as well. There is a Christianity that resists the type of language that you're talking about.
Yes, yes.
There is a Christianity that is almost, if you are not this type of Christian, if you are not, well, let's just call it, you're not right-wing Christian, if you're not this certain, the church is separated from the state, and, the church is not supposed to have a voice in politics, A, B, C, X, Y, Z. Okay. Because that, unfortunately, in my estimation, is the prevailing culture of Christianity at the time, in this present moment.
Mm-hmm.
So then how do we, as Christians, as believers, adhere to what you're suggesting John is asking us to do when that is not the temperature of the water of Christianity right now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I must say I lament about that continuously. 2 things. One, it is not unique that we have these various kinds of approaches to the Christian faith. As you know, in the 1st century, it wasn't Christianity, it was Christianities. There were competing versions. And we know this from, for example, Paul. He goes around and he starts a church, he leaves to go start another church. While he's out starting another church, someone else comes into the church he just started, teaches a different Christianity, a different way of understanding the faith, and then he has to write a letter to try to correct. The same thing is happening with John. John is going to these churches in Asia Minor. There are other prophets who call themselves prophets. He talks about them in Balaam and Jezebel are the names he gives them. But he goes and teaches one thing about what God is doing in the world. He leaves, and then behind him comes these other prophets that he then must challenge. So this kind of understanding that Christianity does not have or that there are competing versions of Christianity is not new. It's been a part of the faith since the very beginning. So that's the first thing I would point out. The second thing is when someone points to the fact that the church should not be involved in issues of economics or politics or government or war. but only to matters of the spirit. I note, well, you're not reading the book of Revelation, because John is very concerned. Just when you asked that question, I thought to myself, well, where might I go and look in the book of Revelation? Listen to this in chapter 18. He's talking about Babylon, and of course we know that he means Rome. She glorified herself and lived luxuriously, so give her like a measure of torment and grief, since in her heart she says, I rule as a queen, I am no widow, and I will never see grief. The haughtiness, the pride of this great Roman Empire. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her. In other words, diplomatic relationships between governments. He's using the metaphor of illicit sexuality. Who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear and torment and say, alas, alas, the great city Babylon, the mightiest city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And why? One of the reasons for this judgment, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn, since no one buys the cargo anymore, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, slaves, and human life. That's just one aspect, but you almost hear Wall Street in that. You hear a condemnation of economic injustice in that. You hear the buying and selling of human life in that. You hear that Rome is being castigated as an evil power and force because of the way it uses its economic might unjustly against the people in other countries of the world. So there's international politics, there's international economics, there's domestic internal economics, and then there is slavery. There is the market economy of the time. John is challenging all of those because they're not in sync with God's intent for God's people. So here you have, in just those, I just picked that out of the blue from the book of Revelation, an economic challenge based on John's understanding of how God is operating in the world. The market of the Roman economy is unjust and therefore must be, through the proclamation of Christ's lordship, challenged, because it is in opposition to the way Christ's lordship would create an economy, a human economy on earth. That is an explicit understanding that the church is involved in the social structure, in this case, the economic structure. I could just pull out some other places where you'd be talking about politics, or you'd be talking about militarism, or you would be talking about the social interaction between people in local governments in the book of Revelation. John he looks up into the heaven, through that door into the heavens, to be sure, but what he's saying is that when God looks down from the heavenly throne, God sees a commercial, political, economic, social world that has to be transformed. And we need to be a part of that transformation. And if you witness to the lordship of Jesus Christ, you can't buy into all of that, because his lordship is contrary to all of that.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. So I have, thank you for that, for sure. And I hope everybody was listening. This is a message, not a message, a question from Dr. Britton, AKA Rhonda. The book ends with, even so, come Lord Jesus.
Yes. Yes.
Even if we accept that this is not the end time, is it wrong to want it to be the end, to long for the end time? Is that a faithlessness in not patiently enduring?
No, it's not a faithlessness. As a matter of fact, I think the person who both longs for and anticipates the end time is the person who's going to make the most radical change in the present time, because they are living with an understanding that what matters is what God is doing and God is bringing about, and they worry more about that future breaking in than they worry about preserving the present that they live in. So I not only think it's not wrong to anticipate and expect the breaking in of God's rule and God's kingdom, I think that's what John is asking people to do, because he knows that the people who have that understanding will be people living on the edge, and people living on the edge aren't worried about preserving the present. They're worried about getting the present ready for God's coming.
Awesome.
And that's why John is concerned not about the first death, but the second death. So he's not so worried about you dying a physical. I mean, you're so obsessed about the kingdom breaking in that you risk everything for it. He's not worried about losing that life, because he knows that the life that's coming is the one that is the ultimate life, the life worth living. And because of that, he can ask you to do whatever he's asking you to do in the present, no matter what the consequences. And
Right.
you only do that if you believe that kingdom is on the horizon.
That's right. Awesome. Another question from one of my members, congregants. How can we best, this is Callum Ewing, how can we best prevent being led astray by false prophets and false claimants of being Christ, when scripture tells us that many of the faithful will be led astray near the end times?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if I knew the answer, I would have written that book. I think that's the New Testament also says that we should test the spirit. Then the question always is, well, what kind of test? Have I gotten to the point where I'm knowledgeable enough to make that test? I'm not sure myself whether I am. I hope I am. I think you have to have a standard, it's a plumb line. That's the biblical image. You have to have a standard by which you judge. And the standard for John is the Lamb and the witness that the Lamb gave in his life. I say the standard is I think John would agree, but I think the Gospels present Jesus as the standard. And if you are living your life in a way that is in parallel to the way he lived his life, then you're going to make decisions that will put you on the right side of that equation. So what I'm saying? I think the only way to not be led astray is to be so obsessed with living in the image of Jesus that even when someone tries to pull you astray, you don't even have to think about going that road, because that's not a road that Jesus himself would have traversed. So you have to hold on to an image so strongly, so fiercely, that you can't be pulled out of that, the way that image lives itself out. And the image is, of course, Jesus's own life, which becomes the Lamb, the life of the Lamb in the book of Revelation. I once heard a scholar say what has been really important for me, and that is that the end time is not a place, it's not a thing, but it is a person. The end is Jesus. And if we want to stay on the right path, we keep our eyes focused on Jesus. And that is the ultimate prevention from being led astray, because you're so focused on who he is and how he lived that you won't be pulled off of that focal point. That's the advice I would give, because otherwise, I'm not sure. John in the book of Revelation realizes that Satan has the dragon in chapter 12, that is the dragon's role, to deceive. In chapter 12 in the book of Revelation, the dragon's role is to deceive humankind. And the dragon is very good at that deception. And when the dragon was thrown out of heaven for John, the dragon landed on earth, which means that the dragon has us in direct proximity to do that deceptive work. And if the dragon is as powerful as John believes the dragon is, you're going to be deceived unless you have a fixed focal image that you can't be pulled off of. And I think that image is Jesus and the way he lived his life.
Awesome. We're coming into the runway. This is more of a statement than it is a question, but I'm sure you'll be able to speak into it, because I remember this from the language of apocalyptic eschatology.
Okay.
So this is Rhonda again, Dr. Britton saying one of my favorite phrases is the already and the not yet.
Yes.
Ron is asking us to live in that tension. Can you just speak to that for a moment?
Yes, well, it's one of the most potent images, I think, in New Testament studies. Jesus comes proclaiming in Mark chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, that the kingdom of God, the reign of God is at hand, that it's already here. It's broken in. I think it's broken in his ministry. And yet the book of Revelation acknowledges that because Christ is now enthroned and it reigns as Lord and Christ in heaven with God. So the hope for reality is here. It's at hand. And yet it has not been fully consummated. It's something that's still out there in the future. So we have a hold on a thing that has not yet been fully consummated. And one of the images that I remember reading that was potent for me was, matter of fact, my wife had never seen Saving Private Ryan, so we watched that last weekend. And you know, the whole sense of D-Day was used as an example. In D-Day in World War II, practically speaking, the war was over once that day, that landing took place, and the Allied forces were in France. Pretty much the war was over. And yet there was still a lot of fighting to be done. And that fighting was really to bring to conclusion the reality that had already been put in place on D-Day and the victorious landings that happened on D-Day. Well, I think what the gospel writers and John and Paul in his letters are trying to suggest is that God's reign has broken in. That rule has already now identified itself as victorious, and yet there is still some fighting going on because those who are fighting haven't yet realized that they've already lost. So there's a not yet component to this reality that's already taken shape. The last book that I did was called Invasion of the Dead, to suggest that in Jesus, God had invaded this world that's preoccupied with death and deadness, to bring in life. So already in Jesus's life, God has invaded, and yet there is this ultimate invasion that's still out there, which is the resurrection of all the dead. That will be consummation of Jesus's own invasion. And that's why John talks about Jesus as the firstborn of all the dead who are to be raised. Because the resurrection of the dead has already occurred with Jesus, but it's going to be fully consummated at the time when the new heaven and the new earth break in. So we have it, and yet we don't have it. And we live in that tension between celebrating what we have and working toward what God is bringing. And if you celebrate too much with what you have, you become like the Corinthians that Paul was writing to. You remember Paul mocks the Corinthians. Already you're great. Already you're kings. You think you got everything already. You can do what you want in the body because you're saved in the spirit. So you can have so much of the already that you become corrupt in it if you don't keep that expectation that there's something out there still that God is drawing you toward.
One second. I'm going to give, let me just find you, Rhonda. This is pastoral privilege. And so don't y'all be hollering out there. Where did it happen?
Yes, I was actually waiting to say I'm typing something because I don't type very quickly, and so Kirby was asking you things that I was actually in the middle of typing. But one of the things that hopefully before you hang up here that I wanted to talk about, I get this question quite often actually, and in the days of COVID-19, when we have people passing away that we believe who are believers that we believe go on to be with the Lord, and this happens, you know, even before COVID. With every funeral, we talk about the fact that these people have gone home. But I always say to people, I don't know what that looks like. And I always remember this image, and we talked about this in your Revelation class, of the souls under the throne.
That's right.
Yeah. Say how long how long? And the Lord says, not yet, right?
Right.
Wait, you have to wait a little while longer. Can you just talk about that a little bit, Dr. Brian, in terms of what that means for people who pass away now, or who, you know, who have already passed away, and what that image of the souls under the throne, I don't even know exactly where it is, but I'm sure you do.
It's chapter 6.
Chapter 6.
Mhm.
And what does that mean for us after we leave this earth?
Mhm.
Who are those people under the throne?
Yeah, and in chapter 7, you get a similar thing in chapter 7, verses 9 and following, the great multitude that's up there as well. They may not be crowded under the heavenly altar, but they're up there in heaven in the throne room as well. So you get these believers, and they've come through these great ordeal, and they've been slaughtered in chapter 6 and in chapter 7, and then in chapter 20. Verse 4, these are the ones who've been beheaded because of their faithfulness to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. What I mentioned that that book, Invasion of the Dead. I look at my first chapter is looking at the book of Revelation. One of the things I say there is that we need to understand John's definition of life. For him, life is relationship with God. And if life means relationship with God, what we have here as we live in this biological frame of reference that we have on earth is an approximation of life, not life itself. So that we are the souls who are in the heavenly throne room, they are actually the ones who have quote unquote life, the fullness of life, because they are in direct proximity and relationship with God, whereas we are physically distant from that direct proximity and relationship. So when we say that they're going home, quote unquote, we're saying that they are entering into the very relationship that we all anticipate, and that is no separation between us and God. You remember in chapters 20 through 22 in the book of Revelation, you don't need a sun or a moon or any other kind of form of light in the New Jerusalem, because God is the light. God dwells directly with God's people. That's the definition of life. Us with God in direct proximity. We don't have that here on earth. We are always anticipating and looking for that. And that's why John sees the first death as a transition to that opportunity of ultimate life being relationship with God. That's the image of the home, the sense of homegoing, or quote unquote life for the book of Revelation. That's the definition of life. So life by definition doesn't have mourning, it doesn't have grief, it doesn't have death, because it's direct relationship with God. So what we have is an approximation of that, not the real thing itself. And the hubris for John, the hubris of humankind is that we believe we are fully alive. We're only an approximation for John of alive. And we're always striving to relationship with God. When we get that relationship, it won't be here. It will be in that altar, that place where the souls under the altar are. The other thing that's important to me about that text is they cry out, "How long, Lord?" And the answer is, when you read that in the Greek, in the English, it's most often translated, "Until the number of my faithful have been slaughtered." The word number is not in the Greek. Really what's there is until the work has been completed. And what work is it? It's the work of the witnessing to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. So when that witness has finished its course, then God will move. And if chapter 12, verse 11 is right, we participate in God's movement every time we witness. Every time we witness, we participate in the breaking down of the veil between life and death. In other words, the movement of God into our reality, the movement of life into our reality, so that to be in relationship with God, we no longer have to go through that transition we call death, the first death. We are just ultimately in relationship with God. That's the ultimate ideal for the book of Revelation, where that chasm between the first life and true life is overcome. You don't have to transition through that first death anymore. The souls up in heaven, they made that transition and they live in life, quote unquote life.
Thank you so much for finding what life is. Did y'all get that? Life is being in the presence of God. And so something for us to think about, for us to talk about, discuss at a later time. In the book of John, when Jesus says, I came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. And so we know that this John of Patmos is John. And so perhaps this idea of the presence of God and the incarnation of the Son of God gives us some insight into, what life is really about.
Because, you could ask Jesus, when he says, I come that you might have life, you might say, well, Jesus, I already have life. Well, you have an approximation of it because you're not in direct relationship with God. You are physically distant by the very nature of what human nature and reality is. We're physically distant from God. It's an approximation of life. So Jesus can say, I came that you might have life. And that's a part of the now and not yet, because you don't have it fully until that moment when you are in direct relationship with God, like those souls under the altar.
Wow. Well, I think that's a great place to, I know, that was a mind-blowing moment. And I'm so glad that, we did this on Zoom, it's on YouTube, so we can go back and listen to the conversation for further study. Dr. Blount, I want to thank you so much. I know you did not have to do this tonight, but I am so very appreciative of you spending some time with us, opening up the scriptures, especially as it related to Revelation. I was so thoroughly impressed by you saying, oh, we can go here in Revelation chapter 18, we can go here in chapter 6, and so that's just awesome. So everybody, I want you to know who you have been in the presence of tonight. You have been in the presence of one of God's great, not only scholars, but I would even say prophets, as by way of his writing. This is Dr. Brian K. Blount. He is the current president of Union Presbyterian Seminary in Virginia. He has, you can Google him, and he's got a whole wiki page. He's got books from here to there. I didn't know about this latest book, so I got to go pick it up right now. But Dr. Blount, I'm so grateful and appreciative of you and for you, for just your contribution to the kingdom, and for being willing to be my guest tonight for this Revelation conversation. Thank you so much.
It's been a joy being with you and with your church, and it is just wonderful to see you again, and also Rhonda, to see you as well. But I mean, church folk, he is one of my favorite students all the time, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be here with him. All
right, thank you so much, Dr. Blount. I'll be in touch.
All right, take good care.
All right, tell the family I said hello.
I will do that.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.